Hi, welcome back. So in this video, we are going to be going over the basics of HTML canvas. So we are going to be going over drawing shapes, getting paths set up, changing all the styles, so that in the future videos, we can actually get a proper system for our animation set up. So the first thing we're going to cover is resizing our canvas. Now, unlike everything else we're going to cover today, this is done using the variable storing the canvas element directly, not the context, since it's dealing with the actual element. So in order to change it, it's extremely simple. All you have to do in your JavaScript, just like any other regular DOM element, is select the attributes directly. So these width and height attributes can be changed directly through JavaScript. So we can set the width to any number we want, and that will reflect that width in pixels. So we can say maybe 400 pixels, and you can see that extends, and you do the exact same thing for height. So let's say I wanted to make this 400 pixels as well, that would extend. Now, one little handy trick if you wanted to maybe make this full size and make it responsive is you can actually use the document bodies width and height and set them directly, since this is JavaScript and we can access it. So in order to access the width and height of the body, you can use document.body.offset_width or offset height, depending on which property you're going for. And this will automatically set the size of the width and the height to the size of the body, just like that. And if you can see here, it does that just fine. Now, one thing you need to be careful of is this will not automatically refresh it if you resize the window. So you need to have some code that tracks any resizes in the window and make sure that it actually resizes properly. All right, so now let's go and move on to some of the other parts of Canvas. Now, the most basic thing you need to understand is the coordinate system. The entirety of working with our context and with Canvas is based on understanding this coordinate system. So basically, it starts in the upper left-hand corner at 0, 0. The x-coordinate system represents the horizontal coordinates, and the y-coordinates represent the vertical. As you go towards the right of the page, it increases from 0 all the way until your explicitly defined width. So in this case, we don't really know the exact width since it's the document body, but if, let's say, it was explicitly 200 pixels, the upper rightmost corner would be 200 pixels exactly. That would be the x coordinate. Now for the height, it's exactly the same, except as you go down the page, it increases until you reach the entire canvas's height. So in this case, if it was, again, a height of 200 pixels, you would go down from 0 until you reach 200 pixels. So that's pretty much the basis of understanding how everything works. Just make sure that you actually understand it when you are working with the functions that I will show you in a little bit so that you can get everything right. Now, the entirety of Canvas is based off of these things called paths. You use a bunch of functions to move around a virtual cursor, drawing lines and shapes and all sorts of stuff, and then you can apply certain styles and fills to that path. So the way that you would begin a path is by selecting the context and then typing begin path. Now this would effectively begin a path that you can now use. Now there are a couple of useful functions that you can use to actually draw lines and move around with your path. We'll cover shapes in just a little bit, but these are the basics. So you select the context and say move to, and then you input an x and a y coordinate to move to directly. Now this doesn't draw anything, it just moves this virtual pointer directly to that spot without drawing a line, without doing anything to the path. So again, by default, your virtual pointer is at 0, 0. Now you can move this to wherever you want, so long as it's within the boundaries of your canvas. So let's say I wanted to move to 50, 100. This would move 50 to the right and then 100 down from 0, 0, and now our pointer will be at this new point. Now you can do the exact same thing by drawing a line using the line to function. So instead of just moving it there, it would draw a straight line directly from your initial point to this new point. Now you can do this as many times as you want and alternate between them, and when you're done, you can say ct.closePath. Now, this has caused a little bit of confusion because what this does is it basically takes your virtual pointer directly to the beginning of the path of wherever you started. So in this case, it would be 0, 0. So you need to be careful when you're closing off paths because you could create unintentional points in your path. So now we want to actually make sure that we can see everything and work with it. So there are a couple of functions that you can use to do this. ct.stroke will create a stroke around the path, and ct.fill will fill the path with a set color. Now you can set this color using the stroke style and fill style methods. Each of these use hex code, so you can just input the hex code as a string. So let's say I wanted to set this to red, it would be FF0000. You can learn more about hex codes, and there are all sorts of color pickers that you can use to pick these hex codes if you don't know them. And these are pretty basic colors, so it's really easy to work with. But again, if you wanted a more stylistic approach, you could obviously use a color picker to get perfect hex codes. And let's say I wanted to set the fill color to maybe, let's say just pure white. Well, we can't really see that, but with the black stroke, we'll be able to see a fill color. So let's go with a nice mix here. So always make sure to set your fill styles and stroke styles before you actually use the functions so that they actually apply. Remember that this is basically going from the top of the script to the bottom, so you need to make sure that you make any adjustments to your script before you actually work with them. So now this is basically going to create the shape that we wanted. Restart paths. So now we're going to cover the concept of paths and lines. So basically the way we're going to do this is by creating a path, and then that follows a virtual pointer of sorts that you can move around, draw lines with, draw shapes with, and then adjust the path. So the way that you begin with a path is by using the context variable and then saying begin path. So what this is going to do is effectively create this pointer so that we can start working with it. Now there are two commands that you can use to move around at the most basic level, move to and line to. Move to will move this pointer to any points that you define within the coordinate system without adjusting or creating any lines that will have any strokes or fills applied to them. This just moves the pointer. There's also another feature called line to, which does the same thing by moving to the pointer that you, or the position that you set it to, but it also draws a line from your initial point. So before you do anything, you need to set an initial point to actually begin. Now you can use either the move to or line to functions, it doesn't matter. It's just clearer if you use the move to function. Now you're going to input your X and Y coordinates. Remember, it starts at 0, 0 in the upper left-hand corner. So let's say we wanted to start at 0, 0. This is going to start directly at the beginning. Now we can start drawing some lines. Line 2. And then let's say we wanted to go 50 to the right and 100 down. And then we can draw another line. And remember, this is going to draw a line from whatever point you're at last. So if we wanted to go to 100, 100, this isn't going to go 100 to the right and 100 down. This is going to go from the right coordinate of 50 to the right by 50 to reach 100, and it's not going to move down at all since this is the new coordinate that you're giving it. Just like that. And then you can close the path using ct.closePath. Now, you have to be careful with close path because what this is going to do is basically move it back to the beginning and draw a line. So you need to be careful with closing paths because sometimes you can create unintended lines that you don't want. Alright, so now let's go ahead and actually finish this off by applying some styles so that we can see it. Now, there are two ways that you can do this. There are two different styles that you can apply using these paths, strokes and fills. Now both are done using the stroke and fill function. So you can say ct.stroke or ct.fill. And you can also customize them. So at the beginning, you can use the property stroke style or fill style to change them. Now these take hex code colors, so there are a ton of color pickers online that you can use to get hex codes if you want a really nice looking color. And what you can do, as you can see, is adjust the stroke color and the fill color. Fill style, and I can set this to whatever color I want really. And you can see that works perfectly. So always make sure to run these commands before you actually call the functions, because since this runs synchronously and it runs the code from top to bottom, you want to make sure that you actually adjust the styles before you fill them. Now, if you want to adjust the width of the stroke, you can use the line width function. So if I just type line width, or sorry, property, not function. If I type the line width property, we can adjust the width of our stroke in pixels. So if I say 5, you can see that adjusted it. So there you go. Let's go over what we have done so far. So we began a path here. We moved our cursor, or in this case, set it at 0, 0, so top left corner. And then we drew a line to 5100 from 0, 0. So we went to the right until we reached 50, and then we went down until we reached 100, and then drew a line from there to there. And then we drew another line to 100, 100. So in this case, we moved again right 50. So we moved right until we went from 50 to 100, and then we moved down from 100 to 100, which technically you didn't move at all. And then finally, you closed off the path so that drew a line from that point to the initial point at which you began the path, which is 0, 0. So that's pretty much the basics of strokes and these types of basic line shapes. Now we're going to move on to the more complex direct shapes. So we're going to start drawing rectangles and circles. So just like before, you do need to begin a path, set a point, and do all that, but a lot of this can be condensed into a really quick, simple, and very easy system. So we're going to begin a path here, And then we're going to just move to a point that's a little bit off so that we don't, oh, sorry, didn't mean to do that. Move 2, and then we're going to say maybe 200, 200, so it's a little far from the rest of our shape here. So to draw a rectangle, you can use the rect function. So you go ct.rect. Now this is really simple. All you have to do is feed it the initial coordinate, so that's going to be the top left corner of the rectangle. So we're going to say 200, 200 in this case. And then we set the width and the height. So I'm going to say 50 and 50. Just like that. And then we're going to close off the path. Oops. Now, of course, this doesn't actually show the rectangle. Although it's there, the path still needs to be stroked. So we can use the stroke and the fill to do this. Now, of course, you can adjust the settings and do whatever you want. But a simpler way to do this would be using fill rect and stroke rect, which is much easier since you don't have to call stroke and fill every single time. So what you can do here is instead of calling this, you can type stroke rect. And that's basically just going to take whatever your stroke color is and stroke it along with it. You can also use fill rect to do the same thing except with fill. Again, it's taking directly from the setting that you set there. Now that color is a little jarring on my eyes, so I'm going to keep this as stroke rect. Alright, so that's how you deal with rectangles. Now one thing you should note is you don't actually need this move to property when working with rectangles, since this rect property deals with it directly, moves it, and takes care of it, sorry. But of course it is just good habit to move to an initial point to get in the habit of working with canvas and canvas paths. Alright, so now let's go ahead and move on to rectangles. Alright, so now let's go ahead and move on to circles. Now circles are a little bit more complicated since it deals with a concept called radians, but it's quite easy to work with once you get used to it, so I'm going to take you through that here. So just as with the rectangle and with the normal shapes, you're going to begin a path. And we're going to set an initial move to coordinate since it's just good practice. So we're going to say maybe 300, 300. And I should actually add that one back here. And now we are going to create the circle. Now there's no actual direct function to create a circle. What you use is a function called arc. Now what arc is going to do is allow you to draw a piece of a circle or a full circle, and you can adjust the angle that you want to draw it at. So we're going to say ct.arc, and then we're going to start with a bunch of properties, as you can see here. So the first is the x and y coordinate of the center of the circle. So this is the exact center of the circle, or in this case arc, that you want. So I'm going to say 300, 300. And then you're going to set the radius in pixels. So let's go ahead and say 50. And now we actually add the start angle and end angle that you want. So one thing that you need to consider is this doesn't use degrees. So it doesn't go from 0 to 360. This uses radians. Now, pretty much the only thing you need to know for now is 360 degrees is 2 times pi radians. So what you can do is just use the JavaScript provided constant for pi and then multiply it by 2, and then that will give you a full circle. Now for the most basic form, what you can do is just cut it in half or cut it in quarter to determine if you want a half or a quarter circle. Or you can just do some quick math and figure out if you want like maybe a very specific percentage of a circle. But basically here, what you're going to do is set the angle that you want to start at, and then the angle that you want to finish at. And that's going to draw that part of the arc. So if we want to draw a full circle, we need to start at 0 and end at 2 times pi radians, since that's the equivalent of 360 degrees. So what you can do is 2 times math.pi. And then we can close the path and stroke it. And as you can see, that draws a full circle. Now one quick thing to note here is that it does draw this line, since what we're doing is basically drawing a path from this center that we start at out and then around. So to avoid that, So it's important to note here that it does draw this line out and around. Now to avoid that, what you can do is set the move to command outside of the path so it's not included when this path is stroked. Because remember, every movement is tracked when you're moving this path, so you really need to make sure that this doesn't happen. Now what the arc actually does is it takes the center of the circle, goes to the edge, and then draws around in a clockwise direction. Now, one thing you can do with the arc, if you wanted to draw parts of the circle to change its orientation, is you can actually add an optional boolean which specifies if you want the arc to draw counterclockwise. So by default this is false and it draws clockwise, but you can change it to true. Now this is quite redundant, since if you wanted to draw a part of a circle you could technically just adjust the start and ending angles, but of course it's there if you need it. So that's how you draw circles. Now this covers all of the basics of Canvas that you can use, and I encourage you to go and try and make your own shapes, create all sorts of designs and things. For now, nothing's going to be live, it's all static, but in the future, when we start getting into more design territory and developing systems to actually track these shapes and move them, then we'll start seeing some really impressive results when we start drawing and moving these around.